Evening, everyone. Welcome to No Accounting for the Love of Football. One night only in the crypt. Another place where people come to worship. Surprised to see no football shirts tonight, but there you go. What can we do? Just as why I didn't wear mine. My confession is I'm a Millwall supporter. Don't know what to say about that, but it just happened, and there's nothing I can do about it. My dad supported Man United, and he sent me to bed when in 1968, was it? Sometime like that, 1968, and the full-time score against Benfica, which a lot of people forget, was actually 1-1. Man United needed extra time even then to win the European Cup. So he sent me to bed and then expected me the next morning to still be a Man United fan. Well, that will change. So I'm not. And when we started talking about this, particularly Kieran was my inspiration. He entered his podcast for our PQ Awards and he won easily. And I'm sure lots of you listen to his podcast. It's absolutely fantastic. And while I was thinking about it, the Sun did a great story about Ed Sheeran and Jack Grealish. And basically, they were just reveling on the fact that Jack Grealish, who earns £42,000 a day, had now been overtaken by Ed Sheeran, who earns £170,000 a day. So I will stop talking because you're not coming to hear me or see me talk. You come to hear the experts. And so first up, we have Sofia. And she's going to introduce herself, and then she's going to talk all about football and tax.
I am. Hello. So I've got about 10 minutes, and what I want to do is just start the evening off by talking about why is tax so important in football. And then I'm going to run through three, what I think are interesting tax cases, three football tax cases, and then just finish off with one to do with F1, because it's my favourite tax case and I want to squeeze it in. So why am I here as a tax person talking at a kind of a football finance event? There's a few reasons. One, footballers are some of the highest taxpayers certainly if you think about Europe, they're some of the highest taxpayers in Europe. They're a really easily identifiable population. And governments have really started to realise that actually we can recover quite a significant amount of tax from our footballers, and potentially they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing or they've been misadvised. And so we are seeing a huge number of investigations into footballers. What does that mean if they get investigated? So you might think, oh, okay, well, I'll just have to pay some tax and that's the end of it. But unfortunately, there's a whole plethora of consequences that can happen if you're found guilty of effectively tax evasion. So we know from the popular press that Ronaldo and Messi, they both have suspended prison sentences to do with IRCs and tax issues there. Ronaldinho, his passport was confiscated in 2 different jurisdictions. And then there are quite a lot of footballers who have their assets frozen when they're under investigation. And having your passport confiscated and your assets frozen, this happens way before you've actually been found guilty of anything. These are kind of like a preventative measure. And so you can imagine how stressful that is when you're trying to fight a case and you've got, in one case, 6 million of assets being frozen and you're not actually able to instruct a good advisor. So this is a real problem. Footballers understandably are concerned about it, and governments are saying, actually, we want to make sure that we're recovering the right amount of tax. On the flip side, you also have some jurisdictions utilising their tax system to encourage footballers to come and play for them. So Denmark used to have a preferential tax regime for footballers. Italy just changed theirs, but they had a preferential regime for footballers. And there's a few different jurisdictions that are playing around with that, and they are trying to encourage, I guess, footballers to come and play in their country and offer them reduced taxes. So it's a kind of a two-way street. They're using it as a carrot and a stick in both of those cases. Now, I want to talk about a couple of different tax cases just to illustrate some of the issues that we've got. So the first one is Yalla Belassi, and I will write down, if anyone wants to go and read the case, I will write down the case references afterwards. He moved to Turkey and he specifically wanted a net contract. So a net contract means, I think it means you just get paid what you're going to get paid, you don't pay any additional taxes. I'm seeing some nods, yes. You think I've got a net contract, no additional taxes, I know what I'm getting paid, that's that. That's what he thought he signed. 2 years later, he was doing his tax filings in Turkey, and there was an additional personal tax liability that was payable. Not on anything other than his employment income, but it was still payable. And he took the club to CAS and to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and said, clearly, I'm on a net contract, the club has agreed to pay my taxes, so they need to pay this additional liability. And I actually, up until reading this case, I would have agreed with that. I would have said, I think that's a fair argument. CAS said, no, the club is a net contract in the way, because it's all Swiss law, a lot of the contracts are Swiss law, so a net contract would actually mean the club is responsible for the withholding, but it's not responsible if you have additional taxes due at the end of the year or of the period. And so the player had to pay additional taxes. It's very confusing though, because there was no, in the contract, they didn't define net, they didn't define it in the pre-contract, they didn't define it in the contract, they didn't really understand who was responsible for what. So it wasn't a great example for kind of contract law, but one of the things they said is the player should have sought local tax advice. He was a very well-known player, he was represented by excellent lawyers. If he wanted a net contract and if that was the reason he was making the move, he should have gone and got local tax advice, and that was called out in the case. So I think that's an interesting example. And the first query that came to CAS was, is CAS even the right jurisdiction for a tax dispute? And the answer was, it's not a tax dispute, it's a contract dispute. It just happens to relate to tax. So we're seeing it kind of mesh into sports, into football in that way. The second case is about a Saber, and he was a player and he played for a Chinese club. Chinese clubs notoriously give net contracts because you can get quite advantageous tax relief if you're a Chinese employer and you're bringing in foreign employers. So his net contract said, we'll cover all your taxes, but if you get any tax rebates, which we're going to apply for to the Chinese government, those tax rebates belong to us as the club. So he signed that, that was fine. Then he decided to leave the club and they signed a settlement agreement, which said that we, the club, will pay you your £500,000, but any tax rebate that you get from the Chinese authorities comes to us immediately. He signed it, that was fine. The club paid him £200,000. They didn't pay him everything. And then 2 days later, he got £1.5 million back from the Chinese authorities. And he says, do you know what? You've breached the contract. So you didn't pay me my 500. I'm not going to pay you your 1.5 million. And I think we all know where this is going, but it went to CAS, and obviously the player had to credit the amount. So he was still entitled to his $500,000, but he had to pay the Chinese authority, the Chinese football club, that huge rebate that he'd been given. So again, we are seeing, I just think these are kind of interesting examples of seeing how tax kind of interplays. Then, how are we doing for time? So we haven't, no one's been checking. I'm just going to go on. Yep, I will. Okay, I shall. Then we have, so very, very brief, I've got two more. So very briefly, the next one is about Vucenic. He was a player that was playing for Roma and Juventus. He went and played in the UAE. So he went out there for 3 years and played for a club in the UAE where it's a notorious no tax jurisdiction. He didn't pay any tax, he had a great time. He came back to Italy, and then when he got back 3 years later, Italy said, oh, actually, all that money you earned in the UAE, we're going to tax it because we think you never officially left Italy and broke Italian residency. So that was the case where his assets were frozen, and in the end, his liability ended up being about €6 million. It's wild, and his argument was, I clearly did break residency. I'm not going to get into the whole complexities of residency, but he said, I broke residency. My wife and children lived with me in the UAE. I worked in the UAE, I was living there. And they said, the Italian authority said, your wife and children didn't live in the UAE because this is the school they were at, and we can see they were clearly living in Italy and having a great time. So that's a lie. So rule number one, don't make such a blatant lie that can be checked. And he'd also continued, the player had continued to invest in Italian real estate. So the Italian authorities said, you are continuing, you want to benefit from the Italian system, so you've got to continue to pay Italian taxes. And again, if you read the case, he says, I did this move specifically to bank, just to make a nice little sum of money towards the end of my career and not pay any tax on it. So players need to be mindful, but it's not just players, it's also advisors. So this is the F1 case, which is called Mullins. He was the lawyer for Bernie Ecclestone and his former wife, his first wife, and He's in the UK, so this has come to the UK tax courts, because over the time he worked for that family, he was paid around 40 million in diamonds, holidays, cars, and he says, no, I wasn't paid that. My salary was £100,000 a year and I paid tax on that. Those were just gifts because I am such a brilliant lawyer. And I will also accept being paid in diamonds. But yeah, so that's what his argument was. It was all gifts and it had nothing to do with my employment income. And actually, again, if the wife writes him these beautiful letters saying how much she thanks him and how these are gifts and she's very grateful for his service and all this, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he was found that they're not gifts, they are taxable income. But we can see what starts happening in this world of sport where it seems to be that tax is kind of a bit of an afterthought, and now we're just starting to see these cases sort of come to light. So that's why I think it's important that we're having these conversations. So I hope that was a good start as an overview, and I shall hand over.
Thanks, Sofia. Evening, everybody. Can you hear me at the back, just to make sure? Yeah, perfect. So my name's Kunal. I work for the Deloitte Sports Business Group. So just to say it up front, if anyone has any questions, please stop me. I'll do my best to answer them, and if I can't, I'll pretend I don't hear you. So just as an overview, so our group, for those who don't know about the Deloitte Sports Business Group, our full-time job is to work with rights holders and various clubs and leagues and help them sort of solve complex business cases, and that is our dedicated job. And one of the things that I'm here to talk to you all about is at the end of the year, we come together and put together something called the Deloitte Football Money League. Many of you have read it? Seen quite a few not, so maybe some of the things I'll tell you today might be a bit of a rehash, but yeah, bear with me. So the Deloitte Football Money League, for those who haven't read it, it's essentially a league that we've put together which talks about the 20 highest revenue-generating clubs in world football. And we've done that at a club level, and then actually starting last year, we've done that in the women's game as well, because I think everyone's seen since 2022, I think for me specifically, I say 2022 because the Euros, and I think that was a sort of a seminal moment in terms of when I really started following the game and understood sort of learned to appreciate just how much they put in and the sort of focus they should get, and they've started to get over time. And that's something I'll talk about over the course of this discussion as well. So in terms of just at the club level, right? So some big hitting numbers. The top 20 top 20 clubs have generated about 10.5 billion euros. Real Madrid sort of topping that pile with I think 830, if I'm not mistaken. And really, when we talk about those numbers in isolation, it doesn't really mean very much. But when you think about how they've evolved over time, this number has sort of smashed all the other sort of cohort of Deloitte Football Money League clubs from before. I think it's about 20% by which they beat them by. And if you just learn to unpick, I guess, the three key revenue streams in football, it's really match day, broadcast, and commercial. And broadcast, typically you'd imagine being the huge revenue driver for most football clubs. And that is true when you sort of generalize it. But when you look at the top 20, that's not necessarily true. And this year, commercial revenue actually outperformed broadcast revenue this year. And that's actually also partly true because of just the top half of that league. So when you look at just your Manchester Cities, Real Madrid's, Barcelona's of the world, which are global profiles, they generate a ton of revenue from just their brand. It's not just the broadcast revenue that they get. When you think of the Premier League, they are far and beyond the next highest league in terms of broadcast generation, revenue generation. So it's 2x just the next highest, which is the La Liga. So I thought what might be helpful now to break it down slightly more simplistically is to just go through some of these revenue streams and talk about some of the key trends and maybe some of the interesting findings we had from the report. So in terms of, let's start from the top, match day, right? So I think the one which was most not intuitive for me was that the average Premier League team there were actually 5 Premier League teams in the top 10. And for the likes of Germany, who actually have pretty significant utilization, I was like, well, why aren't Bayern Munich out of the top? And I realized one of the major revenue drivers for match day, and well, no prize for guessing, is the number of matches you host. But in England, you actually have more matches because you have 20 teams in your league versus the 18 in Germany. And actually, a slightly more finer nuance is, when you think of the cup competitions, very few of them have two, whereas in England, you have the FA Cup and the Carabao Cup. So, and these top 10, top 20 sort of revenue-generating clubs tend to go quite far in these competitions. And just for context, in terms of how much revenue that generates, so Liverpool generated about 100 million euros in terms of match day revenue, and their per day, just gate receipts, is about 3.5 million. That's 3.5%. So for every additional game, that's not even counting F&B and concession. So the incremental game means a whole lot more than I actually anticipated going in. And I see that as English teams, if they get a fifth berth into the UCL, which it seems like they almost certainly will, I see the English team's dominance being sort of continuing into the match day. Speaking on English team dominance, it's probably good to get into broadcast. Again, I think the UCL factor will be a major driver in terms of broadcast revenue continuing to flow into English clubs. But I think, when you just look at the macro factors surrounding football, all the big 5 leagues, if you just look at them in isolation today, the international and domestic rights that have been struck in the last couple of years have either flattened or gone down, barring the Premier League. And I know everyone says, well, they sold more matches, but there were more matches to sell. And that is sort of a lever different leagues are using differently. So you have some leagues seeking external investment to try and drive their international broadcast. And that's something I think they've seen, just the formidable sort of nature of the Premier League's international broadcast. And it's something they were like, okay, we want a little bit of that action. You're seeing the Premier League's international broadcast actually outperform their domestic, which even when you take a step back from football, that's almost unheard of in any sport. Like if you think of the IPL in India, the domestic rights are by far and beyond the highest revenue generator, the NFL, the NBA, the MLB. So, just in that context, the global sort of attraction and profile of the Premier League, that sort of just puts that into context a little bit. And I think the other big 5 leagues are doing their best to try and bridge that gap, which probably brings me nicely onto commercial. So, and I'm going to sort of probably talk to this through an example. Right? FC Barcelona, you saw a couple of years ago them having to let go of Leo Messi. And that's quite clearly just purely a financial decision. And when you try and think about, okay, what can clubs do if broadcast is slightly less controllable on their part? Match day is hugely driven by their on-pitch performance, and I guess everyone wants to do well, but there's only so much, again, you can control that factor. Then commercial suddenly becomes a really, really important factor. And I think through 2 more macro sort of ecosystem factors at play today, if I can call it that, probably rubbish wording, but you talk about financial sustainability, and if you are a club like Chelsea that is trying to get into financial sustainability, into the positives, you don't want to be banking on, well, especially this season, on performance. You want to be banking on your front of shirt sponsors who are slightly stickier. You want to be banking on, the way Tottenham tries and creates their stadium as year-round entertainment venues. You're not just tied to the 30 or 40 games on the 30 or 40 match days that you have. You are using your stadium to the best possible effect and sort of insulating yourselves from on-pitch performance in a big way. And I think, I mentioned one factor was financial sustainability. The second one is external investment. When you think of any investor, what do they want? They want a little bit more certainty around cash flows. You're seeing people invest in the Championship and in League One. It's not because they're just purely passionate about their teams. They also, especially international investors, like North American investors, which have flooded football, they are looking at operational efficiencies as to how can we take this league that we think has raw potential into the Premier League and ultimately sort of exit at a pretty high valuation. But when you think of the top 10 Deloitte Football Money League teams, they're always in and around the top 10, and a lot of their financial certainty is driven from commercial. So I just wanted to pause there, but yeah.
What do you mean by commercial? Is that shirt sales? Is it stadium naming rights?
Great question. So So the commercial essentially covers, and it is slightly a catch-all of operating revenue, but I'll talk about the 3 or 4 key drivers. So one is sponsorship, which is obviously a major, and especially front of shirt sponsorship, but you're seeing sleeve sponsorships, etc. Also now commanding a pretty high sum. So sponsorship is a big one. Stadium revenue, as I touched upon when I spoke about Tottenham, is a major sort of revenue driver, and you're seeing that a lot more today. I think almost every football club, every day I read, has come up and said, well, we're planning to redo our stadium. That stems from the fact that they're trying to generate additional commercial revenue. And then finally, even things like pre-season sales, pre-season tours actually fall under commercial. I was actually, a few years ago when I picked up a few P&Ls, I was like, oh, I didn't really expect that. It's because it's more just a road show for your team to go and play, and actually some sponsors even have a performance-linked incentive if they tour Asia, because that is a strategically important market for them. So those are just probably two of the few sort of drivers that really heavily influence commercial. And I would say more recently, when you talk about sponsorship, it's sometimes you just think of your front of shirt and your sleeve, but when you think of the Barcelonas of the world, and even the top 5 revenue-generating teams in the Money League, they all have now started to sell stadium naming rights. And it's because they're just looking at new levers that, as I said, are sticky and also command a huge sum. And I think a few of the iconic venues like the Nou Camp are like, you know what, we want to invest early, and we're okay if Spotify, it's called the Spotify Stadium, although I don't know how many people call it that. But we're okay to do that if it means we can retain the likes of the future Leo Messi and have that around our club. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but all good? Yeah? Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm happy to speak about the women's game.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you a couple of examples of naming rights and the value, but also any insights on Tottenham Hotspur.
So valuations, as you can imagine, they keep that pretty close to their chest, and they're usually bundled into a slightly larger package. So like the Etihad in Manchester City, Spotify is also a great example. So, I mean, my honest answer is I can't give you a single number that can do it, but I think Tottenham's done a good job in trying to tell you how much they think it's worth, and you could probably gauge based on the profiles of the other clubs, how much they're generating. And actually, it's probably good for me to just also touch on just the women's game a little bit, because I think that is, I mentioned that they've gotten a lot of airtime in the last couple of years, and as they should, and I want them to get a little bit more. And the reason I say that is because, people always talk about the women's game in the context of, well, they're being subsidized by the men's game. Well, that's true, but I mean, they have to start somewhere. And if there's no external investment, and there is a little bit of complexity as to investing into the women's game, because today the women's teams are structured in a way where they're sort of either a subsidiary of a broader group, or they're just sort of really tied into a really convoluted structure. So it's not very easy. You have Lyon, who's sort of split that out, but you have a lot more football clubs today thinking about, well, hold on, can we actually have external investment come directly just into this, and it doesn't necessarily impact our men's team or even the stadium, because that's also a very separate asset, which are with a very different risk profile. One's a real estate asset, one's a sporting asset. Go ahead.
How are these commercial deals regulated?
In terms of is it fair value?
How are they insured? Who's regulating these deals to make sure that all these deals are, at market value?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and honestly, I'm sure Kieran will talk about it, and I've heard him talk about it on his pod a few times, so I'm not going to step on any toes. But there is naturally, if there is something where you're talking about, okay, there's being 100 million for the front of shirt, you sort of know that's a little bit over the mark. So I think at first instance, it's probably just a sniff test, but then people will sort of shout if they feel that it's a little bit more, and that's when you have a little bit more of a detailed dive. And I'll leave that to Kieran to touch on a little bit more sophisticatedly than I can, because I'm not entirely aware of the process of what happens after. But a lot of the work we do is tend to try and put a value to sponsorship, and how we do that is benchmarking through different clubs in different countries, but also in different sports for sports which are similar profile. So a cricket sort of IPL in India and the importance of cricket in India is probably a better comparison than an Indian Super League team to, the championship. So it's just things like that you have to use to gauge value in time. I don't want to step on any toes in terms of timing. Yeah, of course.
My question was about the Super League, and I'm just wondering, with the Premier League becoming more and more powerful, especially if they get the 15th UCL position with the whole order you mentioned, for the likes of Real Madrid and Juventus and Bayern Munich and some of the other European teams, is the Super League going to become pretty essential for them to stay ahead of the game as well?
Right. I think a lot of Kieran's questions coming up, but I can tell you about, so in general, when you think about the ESL, right, like when you think of how things have transcended since they initially announced it, there was obviously a huge sort of uproar from the fans in terms of, it should be earned and not just given to you. And, in that context, I think today clubs are a little bit concerned about how would fans react again, because it's not been very long. And I think the second and more important factor in terms of a business side I'll speak to is, I think when you're looking at what UEFA is doing in terms of their format, what the clubs were asking for, especially the big six in the Prem and the Bayerns of the world, was a little of a larger piece of that pie. And I think part of the new UEFA format and distribution is to address that. So I think the combination of fear of fans and their reaction, and the additional monies that is now going to come through UEFA, I think it's a little bit of, it's been kicked down the road enough that at least for us, we haven't had many conversations around ESL. I'm sure there could be egg on my face in the morning if suddenly this comes up in the front of the paper. But for those reasons, I think at least for now, the ESL is not a credible threat.
Okay, perhaps we'll have some more questions when we finish the speakers, and you can ask them a few questions as we go along.
Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I'm Patrick Way. I'm a barrister. I was a solicitor. And I'd like to say I specialise in football tax. I do a lot of football tax, but I do most things. What I thought I'd talk about was a mediation which I'm doing next week, which involves quite a famous footballer. And we're mediating, which is unusual. A mediation, as you know, is outside the court process. And HMRC have agreed to do this. And the footballer has got valuable image rights, and his agent got him from an Italian club to a UK club and charged a decent fee, you'll be surprised to hear. And HMRC want to split that fee between the football club, who paid it, but also the footballer. So they're saying you, the footballer, benefited because the agent took you from Italy to the UK. You should pay, if you're not going to pay half the fee, you should be taxed on it. So those are quite big issues, image rights and agents' fees. My interest started when I was a solicitor, and the law firm I worked for had a famous client, Mark McCormack, who I think at that time was probably the world's biggest agent, and I think he started as a lawyer, and I think he took on Arnold Palmer, I think it was, and he said, I can do better for you, and so he became an agent. In those days, IMG, his company, represented a lot of motor racing drivers, a lot of golfers, a lot of tennis players, and only one footballer. And that footballer, just to date me, was somebody called Paolo Rossi, who was an Italian. Anybody under the age of 60 would have heard of him, so sorry about that. And now I would guess that they've got something like 50 to 100 footballers because the market's changed. So image rights, the deal with image rights, as we all know, is if you're playing football, you get your money on the pitch, but you've also got a valuable image. If you are non-domiciled, we'll come on to that in a second, if you're non-domiciled, what you would like to do is to split your image rights between UK image rights, where you're going to pay UK tax, and your overseas image rights, which you keep overseas and you don't pay tax on them until you bring the money into the UK. Now, I had to explain years ago to an Italian audience how UK domicile worked. These weren't football people, but I thought I'd use a football analogy. This was a mistake, by the way. So I thought I would talk about Diego Maradona. And I was just trying, I think he played for Napoli, wasn't it? Napoli, yeah. At the time, he was playing for Napoli in Italy, and of course, he was Argentinian. So I explained to this Italian audience, from a UK standpoint, we would say domiciled in Argentina, but whilst he's playing football for Napoli for 3 years, resident in Italy. Big mistake. At the end of the talk, quite a sinister-looking guy came up with the sort of stripy jacket and trousers and probably a violin case as well, something like that. And he said, I am Maradona's advisor. Maradona never resident in Italy. So I thought, okay, fine. But their point was you could split his image rights that were abroad. Now, what happens is the UK HMRC have decided, with a change of personnel in HMRC, they don't like the fact that so many international footballers come to the UK and don't pay tax on their overseas image rights. So what they're saying is, whereas I would say those image rights are based abroad, they say they must be based in the UK because you play football here. And even if you are a German footballer with a sponsorship agreement with a German beer company, if you play football here, your source is here. And so they are taking on, as far as I'm aware, about 20 top footballers and saying we want tax on 100% of your image rights, no split. So that's the first thing we're looking at. And the second thing is the agents' fees, as I mentioned. And with agents' fees, what they've said in the last 2-3 years is that they think, as I said at the introduction, they think roughly you should be 50-50 in terms of if you're the footballer, you join a club here, they're saying the club should pay half, you get a benefit in kind in half. Now, you'll have seen there was one transfer in the public news of Pogba when he went from Juventus the second time to Manchester United. I think I read that Mino Raiola got £37 million for that transfer. Now, in fact, he split it 3 ways, which is a bit naughty. So he split it. He got a fee from Juventus for moving him out, a fee from Man United for moving him in, and that was it. And I have no idea whether this is true with Pogba, so I don't act with Pogba, but my guess is the risk there would be HMRC might be saying that a third or a half of what I've just said, 37 million, would be taxed. That's a lot of money. So that's the first issue. How do you deal with that? Well, you deal with it by really focusing, if you can, on getting as much evidence to show that if it's true, that in fact, the agent was acting for the football club. The one I've got next week is a famous footballer. He was playing in Italy, and at that time, one of the Premiership clubs was building, and they wanted to build this fantastic team, and he didn't care whether he went from Italy to Spain or to the UK or stayed in Italy. It didn't matter to him. So our argument, wish me luck, our argument is that from his point of view, 100% of the agent's work was done for the UK football club. Now, we'll see how that goes down, because they're going to say half. Now, the thing about mediation is it's very difficult to mediate a technical issue. So don't tell anybody, but the overseas image rights, I've already said to the mediator, I'm a bit dubious about this. I don't think you can have a mediation at whether the source as a matter of law is here, there, or wherever it might be. But what we do have lots of costs that were involved. The overseas image rights does involve paying people a lot of money, so we've agreed that we can negotiate by way of mediation that amount. With the agent's fees, the footballer is 100% adamant that he didn't care where he went, and the agent was exclusively acting for the football club. So if you would like to invite me back in 10 days' time, I'll tell you how it gets on. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Kieran and I'm a teacher. Some of you may have heard me. 4.5 years ago, I was persuaded by somebody at the BBC to start a podcast with comedian Kevin Day. And I asked him why. Why me? And he says, well, we can't afford Swiss Ramble and Michael McIntyre, so we decided to bring you two together. Since then, we've got episode 500 coming up in a few weeks' time, and it's been a journey, I think is the word that I would be using, on Stars in Their Eyes or something similar. And we're in this hurricane in terms of football finance at present. And why are we in this hurricane? Football finance wasn't heard of many, many years ago. Well, let's go back to when football was invented, which was 1992 by Sky. Since then, retail prices have increased by 108%. The Premier League has been one of the most successful exports in the history of this country. The revenue of the then 22, but now 20 teams in the Premier League has increased by 2,600%. And this is for a mature industry. This is fantastically successful. And why has the Premier League been so successful? Because in the very first year of the Premier League, it went to Malaysia, it went to Nigeria, it went to Australia, it went to the USA and said, we've got this product and we're going to give it to you for free. Because British football had a terrible reputation. I'm old enough to remember the 80s. I'm old enough to remember running away at the end of matches, having bricks lobbed at me at Portsmouth, having just lost 5-1, and things like this. And football was in a bad place. And so from the tragedies of football which happened in the 1980s, sprung the Premier League. And those revenues 26 times faster than general inflation. Absolutely amazing achievement. Why? Because the Premier League gave those rights away for 5 years to these broadcasters. And then 5 years later, it went back, and the broadcaster says, we love your product. And the Premier League says, well, that's nice to know, in which case, we're not going to give it to you for nothing. And the broadcasters found that the one thing that stopped people cutting the cord, if we didn't get to see Game of Thrones, we don't care. We don't get to see the latest movies, we don't care. We want Premier League football. We had the benefit of English being the world's second language. We had the benefit of it being a live action event. And if you take a look at the NFL, 18 out of the top 20 most viewed TV elements of the United States in 2023 were NFL games. So football has the ability, from an advertiser's point of view, to bring people together live. We don't watch live television anymore. So football rights have become worth more and more. So this is absolutely fantastic. You would therefore expect the Premier League to be fantastically successful from a financial point of view. But there's one slight problem. During the period in which revenues have increased by 2,600%, wages have increased by 3,600%. And 18 out of 20 Premier League clubs in 2022, which was a non-COVID year, lost money on an EBIT basis. The only two clubs that actually made a profit were, first of all, Brentford, and that was on the back of it being their first season in the Premier League. So therefore, lots of players who'd had pay rises were quite happy to be in the Premier League, and they were being paid 30 grand a week on average, which by Premier League standards is low. The only other club to make a profit in 2022 was West Ham United, and that's down to every person in this room because you're paying for their stadium. So we therefore have a scenario at present in which, at a top line level, football is fantastically successful, but at a bottom line level, it's not. If we drop down a tier, if we go down to the EFL Championship, the average losses made by clubs are £476,000 a week. So that means that the owner is having to find the money, or you're having to go and flog off the family silver in terms of the stadium, in terms of the talent, and so on. Even clubs that benefit from the likes of parachute payments are losing money. Sheffield United's accounts came out at 6:10 yesterday morning. My wife, who's here, she can confirm that because I get an alert from Companies House every time that something comes through in terms of the latest football club accounts. So they're out at 6:10. The whole lot were tweeted by 6:45. Yeah, that's my job. The dog, when the dog hears the bleep goes, he knows he's not going to get a walk. It's that bad. And here's a club that's in receipt of parachute payments, so it's got financial benefits which are 4 or 5 times those of the other clubs in the division, and it's still losing over £500,000 a week. Why do we have this financial intrigue, this amazing model? It's because of the gaps in football. There's a gap at the top of the Premier League between the 4 clubs that do qualify for the Champions League and the 2 clubs that don't. That gap this season is probably worth somewhere in the region of 120 to 140 million pounds. From next season, when we move to the Swiss model, it could be around about 200 million. We're going to have additional commercial revenues from UEFA. We're going to have potentially an additional couple of home matches for clubs because we're moving to a greater model. And from my sources, we are operating on Chatham House rules. Okay. UEFA is under a huge amount of pressure to concede more and more money to the elite clubs, as has already been hinted at earlier by one of my colleagues. So if you get into the Champions League, you're going to get all of this money. How do I get into the Champions League? I get it by spending money. I get it by gambling. I get it often by going into the January transfer market and we're 6th and we want to be 4th. So I'm the coach. I go to the chief executive and I say, I've spotted this player, 40 million, Bulgaria's 2nd best centre forward. I reckon that player could make the difference. And then you leak that story to a friendly journalist. So now the board of directors is under pressure. If they don't go ahead with that deal, you leak another story. The manager's unhappy with the board. So what do? The board cave in. So we spend that money. But you cannot get 6 into 4 as far as Champions League places are concerned. And this is why the Super League was a fantastic product from a business point of view, because it completely de-risked your investment in football. You were there by invitation. You could finish 10th or 11th in the Premier League. You can have an absolute stinker of the season, but you've still got that guarantee of those revenues coming in year after year. So we've got the top 6 in the Premier League who are incentivized to spend too much money. If we then take a look at the other end of the Premier League, although that we're operating in an environment with parachute payments, if you get relegated, you're probably looking at a decrease in revenues of 50 to 80 million pounds. That's a hell of a lot of money. Again, you're the coach. You go to the board of directors in January and you say, I've seen the 4th best centre forward in Bulgaria. He'll cost 15 million pounds because we're operating in a different pool. We could sign him and he could make the difference. And again, the board gambles, but 3 clubs are still going to be relegated no matter how much money they spend. So here we've got these issues that we've got an incentive to overspend at the elite end, and we've got an incentive to overspend as far as the bottom of the Premier League is concerned. And then you've got all of these clubs in the Championship, and they want to get to the Premier League. So it gets to January, and the coach goes to the board of directors. I've seen the 9th best striker in Bulgaria for £6 million, and he wants 25 grand a week. Now, the average wages in the Championship are around about £14,000 a week. But for an 18-month or 2.5-year contract, if this player scores those 8 goals, which makes the difference between getting into the playoffs and not getting into the playoffs, you can see why, once again, we have this incentive to overspend. So what we have now in modern-day football is casino game. Everybody is twisting on 19. And when you twist on 19, the house always wins. 18 out of 20 clubs in the Premier League losing money. 24 out of 24 clubs in the Championship losing money. If you drop down to the lower 2 tiers, you see that those losses, they don't disappear, but they are certainly a fragment, a mere fraction of what we are seeing in the top 2 tiers. How do we find a solution for this? Well, we have to have some form of controls, is the answer, according to both the Premier League and the EFL. So therefore, we have these controls. Presently, they're called profitability and sustainability rules. The reason for this is that they encourage neither profitability nor sustainability because they allow you to lose money. Now, I'm an accountant by historical trade. There's a thing called profit and loss, and I know the difference between the two, and you would think that these companies would do as well. Under the present set of rules, you can lose £105 million over 3 years as a Premier League club, or £39 million if you're a Championship club, and there are transitional rules which Nottingham Forest have just fallen foul of. At 6 o'clock tonight, the Premier League announced that it was pursuing a case against Leicester City Football Club. At 6:20, I was on Radio Leicester explaining how the rules operate when you've been relegated from the Premier League to the Championship. Leicester City successfully defended their case that they were not subject to prosecution by the EFL in respect of the season 22-23. And that case, which was defended by Nick DeMarco, who's probably a very prominent sports KC, was absolutely fantastic. But the Premier League was saying, well, if you're not classified as an EFL club, you must be classified as a Premier League club, and therefore we're going to pursue you instead. What will the possible sanctions be? If Leicester City are not promoted, then they are likely to face a financial penalty from the Premier League, and there is an agreement. I won't say a gentleman's agreement because there's no love between the Premier League and the EFL, as we already know, but there is an agreement that if you go up from one to the other and you've been subject to sanctions by the other body, then those sanctions from a financial point of view will be applied. That actually happened to Leicester City in 2016. It's also happened to Fulham. It's also happened to Bournemouth. So we could see that if Leicester City are not promoted, they will be subject to a financial sanction next season. If they are promoted, we could have the unedifying sight at the start of the season. Yeah, I'm a Brighton and Hove Albion fan. I like the start of the season because alphabetically, we're actually in the top 4. And Leicester City would normally start the season mid-table, but Leicester City potentially are going to start the 24-25 season on negative points, which is not the way. It's tough to get there and it's tough to stay there. So that's where we are presently in terms of football finance. We've got the independent regulator, but I said to Graham I'd keep it below 4 hours. So I won't talk about that just yet. Perhaps when we have a chat a bit later. Thank you very much.
So this is really your chance to ask any question you want now. So, and we've got 4 experts, so far away. You just...
Should we take a couple of mics each?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll start over there, that's okay.
It's not what about, there is a question, because I think you'd like to catch on that.
Kunal, yeah.
In a past life, I used to sign off the commercial deals for many of the sports sponsorships for some of the biggest financial services companies in the world. A couple of them I refused to sign off. And as a regulated entity, to answer your question, you are obliged to do this. Unfortunately, as Kieran has illustrated on his pod, there's a couple of clubs including Milan, and dare I say my own football club, which I'm surprised they didn't mention, who weren't paid for various elements of their shirt sponsorship. So one of the most important lessons I would give to you, and it wasn't just the English Cricket Board who learned this lesson, that you do need to do brand due diligence and make sure that at least you're being paid for whatever thing you decide to put across your shirt. To pick up the barrister, which is where my question is, you mentioned about, and I appreciate the confidentiality, what would be the scenario where a player, and I'm going to just pick one particular because he's a prominent player in my other half of his career. So, songs, obviously, when I go to the rugby at Spurs Stadium, which is the only time I go, outside their club shop are hundreds of song shirts marketed at Koreans. But really, they're selling his shirts because he's a Korean national hero, not because he happens to be resident and playing for Tottenham Hotspur. So surely that point must be taken into account with regard to how people are, because they could be German national captain or whatever it might be, and happen to be playing at Chelsea, Spurs, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, actually. I think this is what HMRC get concerned with. I mean, to answer it, not very technically, but sort of technically, in the case of Son, he would have to have an overseas image rights company, and he would have to make sure that all his appearances in relation to image rights took place outside the United Kingdom, and he would have to make sure that they were just selling shirts in Korea and not in the UK. So there's what we try and do is to add demarcation. So in your example, the fact that lots of Koreans come over, as they do, don't they, to watch him and buy shirts, that still would be UK image rights from his point of view. So the split has to be more physical and more geographical than that. But it's obviously difficult, but that's what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, but if you're Spurs and open your club shop in Seoul,
yes.
you're a different challenge.
Yes, I mean, that's true. If you had an overseas entity doing it, you've got more of a chance, yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
This one's for Kunal. In terms of additional revenue, how much does Spurs get by hosting NFL, rugby, music concerts each year? And if it's significant, why don't other clubs do it as well?
Yeah, good question. So I don't have the exact number because this year they haven't released, I mean, at least when we were doing the Money League, they hadn't released it, but I would tell you it's probably less than 10% of their total commercial, probably 10 to 15% in that range. In terms of why do other clubs not do it? So there's probably two answers to that. One, for the clubs that own their stadium, are they in an attractive city, or are they, do they even have the capabilities? The Spurs Stadium is very modern. They have sort of pitch side, which they can just retract their pitch, and they're okay to have, concerts, Taylor Swift, whoever sort of comes down, can actually go there and not destroy the pitch. And the second element is, a lot of the clubs don't actually own their stadium. So West Ham's probably a good example, and it has to be in their clause. Do they have the right to monetize their stadium outside of match day to actually do that? So it's not the easiest thing to do. But yeah, if you're in the right city and you have the right capabilities and not and a good sales team, I think you can attract quite a few of those. And when you just answer your question in terms of why don't more people do it, Madrid is actually talking about it. If you sort of just look at some of these news articles that are being picked up in Madrid's new stadium, they have sort of come out and said what they aspire to get to in terms of non-match day revenue. So there's F&B income, there is museum tours and things like that, but the NFL is very much on their radar. So I think they will see a lot more of that as some of these clubs actually evolve their stadium.
Kieran, you talked about the health of the top line, which is great, but the bottom line is completely opposite for most football clubs. What's the outlook for lots of these clubs? Are we talking about bankruptcy for football clubs? How's that going to carry on? Because shareholders will dig into their pockets, or you'll get some staff mentality, I suspect, in boardrooms. But surely some people are going to run out of cash, and this is going to be a bit of a crisis.
Well, we have seen a number of clubs run out of cash historically. I think there's two things which will protect the game, potentially three. First of all, the find a bigger fool theory is fully in evidence in football. I've had the privilege of talking to quite a few club owners, and they say they come into the game determined to operate it on a sustainable level. They believe that the skills which they have demonstrated in being successful in their own business can be brought into the football club. But then you get the manager coming to them. They've got 3,000 or 30,000 people shouting their name, and it changes your mentality. You leave your brains at the gate when you walk into a football club. So there's that. We've also got the fact that if my local garage goes bust, I'm genuinely very sorry. You know, I've been taking my car there for the last 6 years. What do? I go to the next garage. You cannot do that as a football fan. So therefore, what do is that you rally round, and we've seen this at Portsmouth, we've seen this at Exeter, we've seen this at quite a few clubs. The fans somehow cobble together a bit of money, and it's run as a fan-owned entity. And that's becoming increasingly popular at lower levels. It's increasingly popular at Scotland. We've got quite a few clubs now, including Scottish Premiership clubs, when you can afford to do that. That model works, but it has a natural ceiling, because football fans don't have £476,000 a week between them to run in the Championship. So I think there's a natural ceiling there as far as League One is concerned. Thirdly, we do have the bill starting to work its way through Parliament in the form of the regulator. That will hopefully identify problems at an earlier stage. Doesn't mean it can solve them, but it might act as a deterrent for those people that see football as a quick opportunity to make a bit of money, move on to something else. Doesn't mean that they're good people. Why should it be better for football than other industries? Because football is unique. It is the one thing which binds us. Every person in this room has got a passion for football. I know nothing else, with the exception of ecstasy, which makes me hug a stranger. Football does that.
So going from the same question, as a Liverpool fan, I probably think FSG are probably the best operators in the league. So how do you see them in what they've done? Is that the way that all clubs would be going down the route of? What should be?
Well, this is Fenway Sports Group, who tried to trademark the word Liverpool, who tried to put up the prices of tickets to regular fans who were behind Project Big Picture and the Super League. They are fantastic business people. They bought 100% of Liverpool Football Club in 2009 when it was a distressed asset. They sold 10% of Liverpool Football Club for the price they paid for it 13 years later. Fantastic at business, ridiculously forensic in their approach to all aspects of the club, and this gives them a competitive edge for clubs on a similar budget. The problem is that skill set will only take you so far if you've got clubs who have a bigger budget. So I think they've done fantastically well. I'm very proud to work in the city of Liverpool. As somebody that lives in hotels in the city of Liverpool on 4 days a week, I hate it when Liverpool are at home because the price of my hotel goes from 70 quid to 250. But that's partly due to the fact of the ability of Fenway Sports Group to market that product, to make it a globally attractive appeal.
So does that mean, going back to Kunal's question about that stadium, Liverpool, where they are now, is good, but eventually Man United start creating a new Spurs stadium, Newcastle do the same there, there's limitations to what Liverpool can do.
In the world of football, you're running to stand still because somebody's always building a bigger stadium. Somebody's always coming up with a new innovation. If we can get 7 nights of Beyonce, then I can get 10 nights of the Foo Fighters, then you can get 14 nights of Taylor Swift. It's that constant one-upmanship as far as the ability of clubs to try to innovate in terms of generating revenue. The reason why Jim Ratcliffe is willing to put so much money into ultimately what is a loss-making business is that there is a genuine feel amongst investors that digitalization, the use of AR, VR rather than VAR, and so on, can multiply the wealth. We can only get 75,000 people a week into Old Trafford. We can only get 62,000 into the Spurs' new stadium. I don't know how many people here have been to see the ABBA Voyage show. That's what they're aiming for, to have 20 stadiums dotted around the world with 20,000 people in each, and you are watching Manchester United versus Liverpool live, and you're willing to pay $80 per seat. The technology is not there yet, but they are convinced that they can do it.
And Liverpool, obviously, you've had Everton as well. You're going to have a lovely new stadium.
Hi, I'm very, very interested in football finance in the women's game. And it seems to me that they have already in this infancy stage a huge issue with revenue polarization and almost no financial regulation. And I don't think many people are thinking about financial regulation of the women's game seriously yet. So I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts on maybe how it might look different for the women's game, either in terms of like how financial fair play might work in the women's game that works differently, where it does more than just prevent losses or introduce cost controls. I don't know if it makes sense in that context to have any kind of redistribution of wealth, or maybe it's the case of with the new co for the women's game, whether that entity will be more responsible for redistributing wealth, because they don't have very much money for TV rights. If that's not really where the revenue is, then can they come up with creative stuff around sharing or centralizing commercial revenue? Like, where do you draw the line between what NewCo does and what the clubs can do in terms of their own commercial revenue activities?
I'm usually paid 100,000 plus for to solve this project. So I think so. So let's go back to I guess your initial point, which is the women's game right now. Obviously, it's not a lot of money coming in, but in time, could they have a similar issue as the men's game, where they just are financially irresponsible, and are sort of spending more than they're earning? Is that right? So how do you sort of cap that? So I think right now, I don't think too many people have thought about it, and you're right. And I think because it's just been 2 or 3 years old that people have really taken notice and invested into the game. I think right now, I don't know if they see a need at this point in time. And I'm not speaking for me, I'm speaking about the market. When you look at them, I don't think that is top of mind. I think right now it is, how can we invest in the right parts of the women's game to actually allow them to grow and then grow responsibly. So the new co has, from my understanding, there are 2 elements of it, which is one is commercialization, the second is governance and regulation. I think that'll probably hit the point of how do we distribute this game and distribute the money in a way where they are financially responsible, but also restore a little bit of competitive balance. You don't want to see Chelsea win every game they play. You don't want to see Barcelona win every game they play. And I think an element of that, and I agree with you, is how do we bring in a little bit of parity? But I think the hard balance, and I guess that's the answer I probably can't answer on the spot, is what is the solution to that? I think right now you want to do it in a way where you are still incentivizing enough revenue that you get to see the best players play in the WSL. You get to see the best players actually come in and perform and sort of display their trade. But you don't want to see a foregone conclusion in Chelsea women every time they come on the pitch. So I think there is a fine balance between growing revenue and sort of putting in a competitive balance. And I imagine UK will probably have a lot of thinking to do in the next couple of years on how to get that right.
Yeah, question for Kieran. It's quite topical for me this week as a long-suffering Forest fan, but PSR, to me, I very much subscribe to the view that it is the glass ceiling that will stop a Forest from trying to compete. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of sustainability measure to sport clubs. What is the logical middle ground which helps clubs not go into liquidation, but also helps them compete as well?
When I go on holiday or book a flight, I know that if the airline goes bust, there's a central pool of money which will get me home. If Mr. Marikanakis says, I want to spend X And we set a base figure. If I want to go and spend 2x on football transfers, on football wages, if I also commit to putting money into an escrow account or a football fund which matches that level of money, then he should be allowed to do so. This way, those clubs which are aspiring or ambitious, however you want to describe it, through the benevolence stroke wealth of their owner, can do so. The fans will know that should the worst happen, and if we think about what happened, nobody anticipated what was going to happen to Roman Abramovich in terms of having his assets frozen. If the worst happens, we've got a pot of money which we can use to buy time. And that's the most important thing. You've got wages to pay, you've got rent to pay, you've got all of these bills to pay. You've now got a central fund of money which can be used. So some form of football bond, which is utilised centrally, which is monitored or controlled by the Premier League or the regulator, I think that would be a solution. The reason why the rules were introduced was to stop another Chelsea or another Manchester City becoming competitive in the Premier League, because 4 into 4 went very well. 6 into 4 doesn't go very well. If Newcastle became the next cab on the rank in terms of billionaire owners with relatively unlimited funds, that would have been 7 into 4 and so on. We've got Aston Villa's owners who are billionaires. Marinakis is a billionaire. Football isn't jumpers for goalposts. It is a billionaire's plaything. That can still operate within an environment in which there is greater competition. I'm old enough to remember, and I know you won't like this, I remember Derby County winning the old First Division, Nottingham Forest, Aston Villa, Everton, Blackburn, Leeds United and so on. Those days have gone under the present regime. It's not fit for purpose.
When you say a bond, you mean like an ongoing bond, not just like at purchase?
Well, you could make some form of deposit at purchase, or you go to the Premier League and say, these are my plans for the next 3 years. I'm going to overspend by X. Kapow.
So,
question for Mr. Way. If the tax benefits of being a non-dom are ever actually removed, do you foresee or predict any creative ways that footballers will come around that problem? Because that's something that might be coming up pretty soon.
That's another good question. What I think they're talking about is giving a 4-year window, I think. So I could imagine footballers coming in and out within that 4-year window to keep. Yes. I think that's what will happen. I mean, I think people do react to tax changes, don't they? And I think that's what will happen. So instead of having a lot of players who are retaining a non-domicile under present rules up to 15 years. After 4 years, they'll want to move on. That would be my guess.
Could I just jump in as well on that point? So under the changes, there's something called overseas workday relief as well, which a lot of footballers. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Yeah. So, but I think you're going to see. So for those that don't know, overseas workday relief means you don't pay tax on your income if you've earned it overseas. So if you think of your European players that are playing in Europe or playing for going and rehabbing abroad, etc., they're not paying any. You can apply not to pay tax on that income. And the changes, if they come in for these non-doms, are going to be much easier to claim overseas workday relief because you don't have to segregate your funds. And then I think when you look at how many players stay for over 4 years in the UK anyway, I mean, I haven't done the research, but just a quick look would suggest there's not that many players that are staying over 4 years. So I would be surprised. I think the overseas workday relief is going to be a draw because all of a sudden it's a lot easier and they're all rehabbing in like Dubai, Spain, etc. anyway. And then you're going to have the fact that not that many of them stay over 4 years. So I think it could actually be more positive if the changes come in as they've been written as.
So my question is here. First of all, I'm quite curious to know how you got into sports tax. And on top of that, given that sports is a high-profile industry, are there major barriers to entry these days for income wanting to get into sports tax?
Yeah, so briefly, I got into it. I previously did a lot of tax on divorce work, and just generally speaking, if a footballer has a baby outside of a traditional married relationship, mum and baby can claim to be housed in the same environment as footballer for 18 years. So effectively, they have got a big financial claim against a footballer, and you can do that in a tax efficient way or non-tax efficient. one club must have gone out and had a big night because I was doing a lot of these for one. Oh no, it was crazy. No. So then they said to me, "Oh yeah, it's nice to work with you. Can you handle all my other stuff?" And anyway, I couldn't. So I set up a specific firm. Do I think the barrier to entry in sports tax is high? No, I don't. I think there is a real need for excellent tax advisors who understand sports to be in the space. I think that I spend a lot of my time with HMRC just trying to explain to them, we're not even into the legality point, I'm just trying to explain how the game works, why something has happened this way. So I would encourage people who like sport and are good at tax. There's no one sports tax part of the legislation, as everyone will know, but there are nuances, and each sport in itself has its own, lots of different rules that apply to it. So I'd say, if you're interested in it, absolutely, I would pursue it, because I think the industry needs more excellent sports tax advisors.
Something at the back.
I've got two questions.
Something at the back.
I've got two questions. I think that maybe materials. The first one being Kieran mentioned about the super. Very attractive investors. Are very attracted to this fixed because how long do you think it first? How long it is do you think it would be? And it is competition. And it's fixed income to the last 100% growth as these markets. 100% growth in economic value, 3,600. What's stopping that fixed income becoming? What's stopping that fixed income becoming a meltdown of all wage inflation? Second question is, if 18 clubs are Premier League are losing money, and every single out of the Championship, that's must be doing something. These investors must be doing something. There's some, there's not many methods, so a lot said to the deal. So passionate and half the beat. And how can the likes of the organization such as the Premier stop these other schemes or solve essential questions like advocacy when it comes to advertise and their brands or other countries, etc.
Okay, in terms of your first question, if you take a look at the Super League proposals in detail, and I'm very fortunate that I've got a good working relationship with journalists, and journalists do two things. First of all, they gossip, and secondly, they leak documents. So I've got the Super League proposals sort of on a line-by-line basis. The Super League was fantastic because it set a wage cap at 55% of revenue. So UEFA's proposals under the new squad control rules, which are coming in, they're transitioning into those rules at present, take it down to 70%. The second issue, and I think this really flew under the radar, is that it was not possible to transfer players from one Super League club to another. So the present position that we have, in which player X, their agent is hawking them around to other big clubs in Europe with the promise of big pay rises, that all of a sudden disappears. So you do have much tighter wage control. People say that people will get bored of these matches. I'll be honest, when you talk to global audiences, I'm a legacy football fan, but I'm out of touch with those people who want to see Manchester United play Bayern Munich and Real Madrid and Barcelona every season, in exactly the way that I want to see Brighton and Hove Albion play Crystal Palace every season. I'll never grow bored of it. They'll never grow bored of that as well. So it would prove to be a very lucrative business. You'd be able to jack up the prices for these matches. So we would switch from a loss-making to a profit-making body as far as the Super League was concerned. Where that leaves the rest of football, I think, is an open question. In relation to your second question, are owners filtering money out? They're not. And the reason for this is that we actually have a variety of ownership models. If we take a look at FSG, the Glazer family, Stan Kroenke, and what you might call the traditional profit-maximising owners, they hate what we have in the Premier League because unlike the NFL, unlike the NBA, not everybody is out there to make money. You've got disruptors in the likes of Sheikh Mansour and Roman Abramovich and Mr. Marinakis at Forest and Tony Bloom at Brighton. They're not interested in a financial return. They're interested in what you might call a utility return. They want to win trophies. And the two can't work together. And if you try to maximise your profits, you're going to be outspent by Manchester City and Chelsea, and you're not going to get into the Champions League. So therefore, they lift up the cost base. So they're not filtering out the money. They're just having to grit their teeth and accept the losses.
Okay, that's a
question for Sophia. Most of us in the dealing with footballers have seen some form of victimisation in terms of financial abuse, pension liberations, film schemes, all sorts of unwise investments. Do you think the time's come for not just agents to be authorised, but all advisors to the profession to be authorised?
Yes, absolutely. So again, I don't know the whole makeup of the audience, but you don't, in the UK at the moment, you don't have to be regulated to give tax advice. So anyone can go out and say they're a tax advisor and it's technically an unregulated market. I mean, that might change from what's coming in the budget. But what, in the HMRC inquiries that I see, when you really dig down into it, and Tom, I know you have a lot of experience in this area as well, you don't see footballers saying, I want to avoid all the tax in the world. You actually see them being guided, I don't know what your experience is, into making these investments, and they are doing it off of bad advice, and I really feel for them, and I really, really think there's this horrible rhetoric that footballers are stupid and they don't know this and they don't know that, and you just think, look, if you went into a doctor's surgery and they told you to do something, you'd do it. No one's calling you stupid because you followed a doctor's advice, and I think that there is a massive gap, and I think there's a real need for education. I think the FA should be giving education. I think clubs should be giving tax education, because it is that they will advise them on the law, don't drink and drive, but there are some really, really specific areas in tax where you can make a mistake by trusting somebody, and then you end up with your assets frozen or passport confiscated or a suspended prison sentence. So I've got myself so hyped up here. Sorry about that. I will calm down. But yes, I think there is a real space for that.
Could I just ask to that point? So we're primary for dentists, and they're in exactly the same position as our way for film schemes and all the other things, and they've got huge penalties and fines. So and they have significant.
So there's someone at the back. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I was just wondering on what you think the financial impact would be if they removed the 3 p.m. so 3 p.m. to kick off. Because I heard you talking about a little bit about the impact of just an extra game and what you think could be the potential for the 3 p.m. kickoffs. Because around the world, for example in South Africa, you can go to South Africa and you can watch every single game. And they do watch every single game, like some my in-laws. But here, we're restricted by that. And what do you think that could impact on, for example, the profit margins of the Premiership and the Championship?
Yeah, I feel your pain. I lived in India until like 4 years ago, and it was very, very reasonably priced to watch almost every game I could think of, even simultaneously. I mean, I think it's a good question, and I think you're seeing an insight into what that could give you. So I think the way they schedule the 3 p.m. game, it's obviously not going to be a high-profile game, quote-unquote, of the teams that are performing well this year. I think what's important is to understand how you use that money and what's sort of at stake if you do have 3 p.m. kickoff. From my understanding, who's someone who's not lived in this country for as long as everyone else probably around the room, I understand that it is to safeguard the lower sort of tiers of football and get people to go and support their local club. So I guess if the outcome is you get to watch more football and people stay at home and don't go support their local club, what is that impact that it has both financially and sort of to the players and everything else? So I get your question in terms of maybe there's a number to it, and I think we can sort of extrapolate that from what we saw right now, because the additional 40 to 50 games that we see now are not going to be our United versus Liverpool and City versus Tottenham. it is going to be, I'm sure Kieran will watch it, but a Brighton Wolves and some of those games, which some people, which might not be as high profile. And I think that is really the question to be answered. And so I would focus less on what that might bring, but really what you could do with it if you were to bring it in to still support those sort of local clubs.
If I can just add to that, if you look to see what's happened in terms of the new Premier League TV deal, we've moved from 200 to 280 matches being released each season, but we've not got a penny more in terms of the dollar value of the domestic TV deal. So it's nice in theory. Will the 3 p.m. blackout disappear? Yes, it will. It's a case of when, and it's a case of how much compensation will the Premier League be willing to give to those clubs in League One and League Two. Because if I am in Accrington and it's November, it's cold, I've got myself and my 2 kids who want to go and watch Stanley, but you've got, even if it's Manchester United versus a small club such as Crystal Palace, taking place live, you've got to, the kids won't want to go out. So you have to come up with some form. Money solves an awful lot of problems in football. But trouble is that means that money has to go from A to B. And what we are seeing is that A is increasingly reluctant to give anything to anybody else.
Okay, then we've got time for a few more questions.
Those are questions. Thank you all for giving up time, really insightful talk. A commercial question though. You alluded to earlier things like sleeve sponsors. And there's some teams starting to monetize things such as their training gear, and Chelsea, for instance, Man City. Are there any trends that you guys can do at places like Deloitte, is maybe where we're going, other ways publisher monetizes that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually it's something I should have sort of mentioned earlier as well when the question was asked in terms of what are some of the drivers of commercial revenue. So, retail and merchandising is something that's sort of gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years. So Flamengo, for example, which is a Brazilian club, they almost doubled their retail sales this past season, 22-23. You're seeing Madrid and Barcelona as well. I think Barcelona mentioned that they had breached the 100 million barrier when it comes to retail and merchandising. So you're seeing clubs, there's a few things that they can monetize, and especially the top performing clubs, it's their brand. It's not just their stadium. And I think clubs are getting a lot more creative, not just in terms of what they monetize, but how they monetize it. So business models that they use, it could be as small as Manchester United deciding we're going to have less Nike salesmen in our shop floors. We're going to have more Manchester United salespersons on our shop floors. So sometimes they're as small a margin as that, but they could be as big a margin as let's try and figure out how to get our brand and our merchandise out to more markets and people that actually have that demand. Because there is a strong, strong demand for global sports brands. And it's just about finding the right way to tap that audience. And I think clubs are doing that ever better than before. And data unification is playing a big role in doing that and enabling that.
Yeah, this is a question for anyone who's comfortable answering. You said you don't currently see the threat of the Super League coming back anytime soon, but despite what Klopp and Varane might think, there's actually going to be more games added. Do you think there might be a 39th game added, much like the NFL, the 17th game, to allow more teams to travel to a neutral venue overseas? So Arsenal would go to America, Chelsea would then, they're American now as well, but they sort of go to interest zones where there is a specific interest, maybe Tottenham to Korea, and while they might lose their home and away, if you only had one more game, it incentivises moving abroad and going to a neutral venue instead. So adding the 39th game adds much more commercial, adds much more merchandise, and also adds some broadcast revenue as well. Do you see that happening in sort of a more 50-50 split in the Super League?
So, I mean, it's a good question. I think there was mention of this like many years ago as well about a 39th game and having that, in a neutral venue for exactly the reasons you just said. Do I see that happening? I guess, given the current climate, we even mentioned this in our report. We talk about more games bringing more value, and I think it's important to balance that with just player fatigue. You want to see the best players playing, but you don't want to see KDB sort of pulled off at halftime in the Champions League final. So I think, will it drive more revenue? Yes. But we have to temper that, I guess, with just workload management. You're seeing, Chelsea's sort of starting 11 change every week because of that. So I guess I haven't answered your question head on. Do I see that happening? I don't. I guess if you ask me now, I think the player fatigue and workload management right now sort of wins in terms of just the need to manage that. So for that reason, I imagine that might not come very soon, but I could be wrong if suddenly clubs, as Kieran mentions, they're not profit making. So at the end of the day, if owners try and push for this and it gets voted through, then you just sort of... Exactly. So, at the end of the day, the owners, the 20 Premier League owners vote on topics like this and have decision-making power. And yes, financial incentive is a big role in making these decisions. So you could find that, but I do think and hope that, the player workload management and people sort of realize that at the end of the day, if they're playing 38 games and you can go to 60, 62 games when you have like cities that make it all the way in many competitions, that 39th game, you might not have your best players playing there. So the value of that might diminish if you don't see that.
3 days after the end of the Premier League season and 4 days before the FA Cup final, Spurs are playing Newcastle United in Melbourne. Well, it is branded as a Premier League game in Australia.
It is.
And Edinburgh is a bit different.
Yeah, I guess question for Kieran and Kieran as well. No, sorry. What do you guys think of like the multi-club ownership model? With obviously like City being pioneers, at least in the Premier League, and then recently rumors about like Liverpool potentially bringing in Maguire and expanding to another club. So, do you feel that that's going to help improve kind of commercial revenues in terms of those global partnership deals and other synergies with different markets in terms of multi-club ownership? And secondly, I guess on that point, is it going to create a regulatory problem where essentially like you have deals with Newcastle and Seller, that's potentially an issue, and with the independent regulator coming into play as well, like is that going to be an issue? Or do you think that in the next Deloitte report that's going to be like a higher kind of top line and bottom line operational efficiencies as a result of it? So, pretty open-ended.
Okay. I think we will have revenue synergies and cost synergies, and that's why the model works. It also allows you to shift profits around as necessary. So if we take a look at Manchester City have made a small profit before tax in each of the last 4 or 5 seasons, non-COVID seasons certainly. Yet the City Football Group loses money every season. So those losses must be incurred somewhere. It could be just an amazing coincidence that all of those losses tend to arise in those jurisdictions where there is no form of financial fair play. A cynic might take another view, but I'm not a cynic. So there are benefits. There are certainly benefits from an operational point of view. We are operating in a post-Brexit environment, so therefore it is very useful to have a club in Europe where you can attract players at the age of 16 and 17 because you can no longer bring them to England. So those are the major benefits that I would see. From a regulatory point of view, I think the issue is one for FIFA to deal with because we are moving to a 32-club FIFA Club World Cup. Now that means that there is a high chance of, if you've got an MCO with the likes of Manchester or the City Football Group, where you've got 8 to 10 clubs around the world, that those clubs could have to go and face each other in the FIFA Club World Cup. The one thing that helps me sleep at night is that we've got Gianni Infantino, who always puts the interests of football first, though.
So just to add on to that, on the women's game, right? Like when you think of Mercury 13 and the likes of them that are looking to invest into women's sport and have a multi-club ownership, or at least vying to, one of the things that I found quite interesting is they talked about it almost as being a necessity for the women's game rather than a luxury like it is for the men's game. And the one interesting insight that I took from that was they talked about the limited data that they had on women's sport, on women's football specifically, that was sort of could be harnessed. And they said, well, actually, if we can invest in 3 or 4 teams and have even more data come through and share that data, not just among these 3 or 4, but potentially even open that out and share that with our competitors, because at the end of the day, a rising tide will float all boats. And they said, like, at the end of the day, if performance in the women's game as a whole could improve, then that could be beneficial to, well, obviously the game in the short run, but at the end of the day, I mean, sorry, them in the short run, but the game in the long run, which I found quite interesting on the women's games take.
I'm going to close in a minute, but gentlemen, I'll come to you. It's okay.
We've talked a lot about agents and legal advice during the course of the evening. Is there a growth area that PFA should be taking more involved in, getting more involved in?
The PFA has set up its own business school. It comprises of around about 60 people with experience in the football industry, the likes of David Dean. You've got chief executives of clubs. The members of the PFA are encouraged to engage with that because we're not seeing enough transition from changing room to the boardroom. I'm very lucky. I'm the only academic teaching on the course at present, but I have been very impressed with the degree of enthusiasm shown by professional footballers. I think they get a really raw deal in terms of the perception of them. And also from a teaching point of view, it's great to be able to go into a class with an autograph book.
You never hear about the PFA report, do you? You only hear about the name agents and the name.
Yeah, it's just kind of on the multi-club model again. What's stopping those owners with multiple clubs within their ownership group from doing like a sale and leaseback kind of thing that you would do with a normal asset for say any Morgan Gibbs White? I don't know. Like what's stopping them doing that? Do we have current measures in place to stop that?
We don't. If we take a look at Watford's player of the season in 22-23, Kamara, he was sold to Udinese, who are also owned by the Pozzo family at the start of the 23-24 season. Fantastic player, really promising. So promising that the first thing that Udinese did was that they loaned him to Watford Football Club for the following 12 months. So it happens.
I'm just curious, the Premier League's threshold transaction regime, which is obviously newish, where all the clubs have to report transactions over £1 million. My understanding was that was going some way to give the Premier League kind of oversight on these sorts of transactions potentially, where the league could substitute their own value when they looked at a contract and they thought it was either above market value or below it. Any thoughts on that at all? Has that been effective in any way? Does anyone know if this is something that has actually been done yet, has been tested?
I think there's two issues. As far as the Premier League is concerned, what we are seeing is clubs taking that on board with regards to the sponsorship deals that they're signing, even if they are with not necessarily what would be defined as related parties, but parties that could perhaps be influenced by the owners of the football club, because the owners of the football club are a sovereign wealth fund. So if you take a look at the deal that Newcastle have signed with Noon and Seller and so on, they are at the top end of the expectations, but they're probably just within the limits. Now, Sofia and some of those here, they're tax experts. I was always given tax advice of, if you're dealing with the revenue, don't take the mickey, and the revenue will treat you quite well. Well, I think the same is true with regards to these commissions in terms of the fair value panels.
I think it's a gentleman there, and then...
I think the multi-club model, Kieran raised earlier at the front there, I think that needs to be looked at in a bigger way for other clubs. Because, for example, our good friends at 777, physically here representing and excuse my language, but that's, as a multi-club model, that's just a shit show. It's got to a stage where every club they've got involved in has got relegated. Every club they've got involved in is losing money. And you have to sit there as a fan or a supporter of that club and think, why did we sell it to these people? What is the end game? They've relegated 3 clubs. As we sit here now, 3 of those clubs will probably get relegated even further down the divisions, which is going to lose money, like you mentioned, the start. So how does it prop itself up? They can't keep putting money into something if it keeps losing, because then you'd be silly. And the same thing goes for a club like Burnley. Burnley currently sits second from bottom in the Premier League, and I'm not a Burnley fan, if they go down, I'm afraid they go down. But they also own another club in Serie B that sits third from bottom in the table, that is doomed to go down this season. So the balance of the numbers doesn't work, and you must think as a fan, well, yes, we've got shares in this club, our owners own that club, but it doesn't always work. And another one is a group that own Barnsley. They've just bankrupted a club in Belgium. They're going to bankrupt Nancy in France. And the whole mess of that football club, with tax, with liabilities as a multi-club, has got to be looked at from not just from the EFL or the Premier League standard, but from across the board. That what is the liability of that club against this club? Sorry.
I think the problem that we have with such a multi-club scenario is that there is no overseeing body who is prepared to take responsibility from a global perspective. FIFA will say, well, our main interest is in terms of global tournaments rather than running the global game. I mean, FIFA comes in for a lot of criticism. FIFA actually does a hell of a lot of good work in the game of football in terms of bringing access to a variety of countries which historically haven't had it, in terms of the way that the transfer market is regulated to stop Club A from not paying Club B. But it does not want to get involved at an operational level because it's a slow process and it's a costly process and they've got better things to do with the money. So I don't think that there is a solution. It has to be dealt with on a country-by-country basis in terms of having some form of owner and director test, which if we have one in the UK, well, why can't we have one in Belgium? Why can't we have one in Spain? And perhaps there to be coordination between either the individual regulators or more coordination between individual football associations.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to call it a day, if that's all right. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for tonight, which were CASSL. Thank you, Sunny. It was the ICAW, the ACCA, and HMRC Inquiries, Powers and Investigations magazine. There is such a thing. It's actually quite a good read. And so they look at all the things that you need to do if HMRC are after you. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming down today, and you may be able to get the second half of Wales game, is it? If anyone is really interested in that sort of thing.